The night I realized blood loyalty meant nothing was the same night I learned betrayal could wear a smile and sit at the same dinner table, because while everyone laughed under warm kitchen lights and passed wine like love was endless, my cousin Evan quietly signed papers that erased my name from a future our grandfather had promised me since childhood. And the shock was not loud or dramatic but slow and suffocating, the kind that tightens your chest while the world keeps moving like nothing happened. And if you have ever wondered how revenge truly begins, it does not start with rage, it starts with silence. And before I take you deeper into this story, take 1 second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are watching from, because what unfolds next proves that patience can be sharper than any weapon ever created. My name is Daniel Harper, born and raised in Ohio, middle class on paper, but rich in something far rarer: trust. At least that is what I believed until the family trust fund, a carefully constructed financial legacy meant to protect all grandchildren equally, became the stage for the most calculated betrayal of my life. And Evan was not just my cousin, he was my shadow growing up. Same schools, same summers at our grandparents' lake house, same whispered dreams about what we would do when we inherited the fund that everyone in the family treated like a sacred promise. And our grandfather Robert Harper was a disciplined man, former engineer, emotionally reserved, obsessed with fairness. He repeated it every Thanksgiving like a ritual: this trust is not a gift, it is responsibility, split evenly, no exceptions, no manipulation. And when he passed away, the grief was real, but beneath it flowed expectation, because the trust fund was large enough to change lives, but structured carefully so no single person could abuse it. At least that was the plan, until Evan decided fairness was optional, when greed whispered louder. The first sign something was wrong came 6 months after the funeral, when I tried to access my portion to invest in a small manufacturing startup I had spent years planning, and the bank representative on the phone hesitated. The kind of pause that carries bad news before words ever form. And then she said something that felt unreal. According to our records, you are listed as a secondary contingent beneficiary only. Your cousin Evan Harper is the primary controller and executor. And in that moment my body went cold, because secondary meant nothing without permission. And permission was now controlled by the same person who once promised we would rise together. I drove straight to Evan House that night, heart pounding, not with anger but confusion, because betrayal from strangers makes sense. Betrayal from family shatters logic itself. And when he opened the door, his smile was practiced, calm, almost sympathetic, like he had rehearsed this moment. And he said, "Daniel, I was meaning to talk to you," and that sentence alone confirmed everything. Because people who intend honesty do not delay it. Inside his living room, surrounded by furniture purchased with trust fund advances he claimed were temporary, he explained it all like a businessman presenting a deal: legal loopholes, updated amendments, power of attorney forms, signed during our grandfather's final hospital days. And the words blurred together because all I could hear was the echo of my grandfather's voice, promising equality. And Evan finished with something that hurt more than the money itself. He said, "You are smart, you will land on your feet." I just took the risk first, and that was when I understood the real betrayal was not financial. It was moral, because he believed success justified theft as long as it wore a suit and carried a signature. I did not yell, I did not threaten, I did not expose him to the rest of the family. Instead, I nodded slowly, thanked him for explaining, and left, because revenge does not rush, it observes. And during the weeks that followed, I played the role Evan expected: the disappointed cousin who complained quietly but lacked the resources to fight back. I attended family dinners where Evan spoke confidently about investments, about expanding the trust value, about protecting everyone's future, and I listened. Because information is power when collected patiently. And what Evan did not realize was that in his hunger to control everything, he left fingerprints everywhere: bank transfers routed through shell accounts, rushed real estate purchases tied directly to trust fund leverage, silent partnerships formed without required consent. And the more he grew comfortable, the more careless he became, because arrogance convinces people they are invisible. I took a second job as a financial compliance analyst, not because I needed the money, but because I needed proximity to systems that explained how white-collar crimes unravel slowly and legally. And every night after work, I built a quiet archive: timelines, documents, screenshots, public filings. Nothing illegal, nothing stolen, just pieces Evan assumed no one would ever connect. And the most important part was restraint, because exposing Him too early would only push him into defensive mode, and I did not want panic. I wanted confidence, because confident people make mistakes openly. Meanwhile, Evan's lifestyle escalated: new car, vacation photos, subtle arrogance creeping into conversations. He spoke about risk like he invented it, and about family like it was an obstacle. And when an aunt once joked about fairness, Evan laughed and said fairness is flexible, and that sentence became my internal signal that the moment was coming. What Evan never questioned was why I stopped asking for money, why I stopped complaining, why I smiled more, because he mistook silence for surrender. And surrender was exactly what I wanted him to believe, because the most dangerous opponent is the one you underestimate. And while he focused on expanding his control, I focused on designing an outcome where he would lose everything without me ever raising my voice. The trust fund was built with rules, and rules are weapons when applied correctly. And the same amendments Evan used to sideline me also required transparency audits under very specific conditions. Conditions triggered by conflict of interest, and Evan had created many of those without realizing it, because greed narrows vision. And when I finally met with an attorney, I did not say I wanted revenge, I said I wanted accuracy, because accuracy destroys lies far more effectively than emotion ever could. And as we reviewed my archive, the attorney leaned back and said something I will never forget. Your cousin did not just betray you, he built his empire on a legal fault line. And that was when I knew this story would not end with confrontation, it would end with collapse, slow, public, undeniable. And while Evan slept comfortably believing he had one, the counterplot was already moving, silent, patient, and unstoppable. The real shift happened the moment I stopped thinking like a victim and started thinking like an architect. Because revenge is not about destruction alone, it is about structure. And once structure exists, collapse becomes inevitable. And while Evan continued presenting himself as the guardian of the family legacy, I quietly became its historian, tracing every deviation from the rules our grandfather had embedded into the trust, like pressure points waiting to be touched. And the brilliance of the trust was that it punished ambition when ambition crossed into control clauses written decades ago that no one bothered to read closely because they assumed trust meant safety, and Evan assumed the same, which was his first fatal mistake. I began attending financial literacy seminars hosted by local universities, not to learn basics, but to network. Because systems are run by people, and people talk when you listen long enough. And through one casual conversation, I learned about a regulatory consultant named Marcus Hale, a former internal auditor who specialized in unraveling mismanaged family funds, not through lawsuits, but through compliance reviews that triggered automatic freezes. And I scheduled a meeting under the guise of curiosity, bringing nothing emotional, just documents, timelines, and questions. And when Marcus reviewed the trust structure, he did not smile. He frowned, which told me more than excitement ever could, because professionals frown when they see inevitability, and he explained that Evan's mistake was assuming power of attorney granted immunity, when in reality it increased scrutiny if activated under questionable timing, especially during medical decline. And suddenly the pieces aligned, because those hospitals' signatures Evan bragged about were not shields, they were vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, Evan invited me to lunch one afternoon, his tone casual but loaded with subtle superiority, offering advice about investments like I was a junior employee, and I played my role perfectly, nodding, asking naive questions, praising his foresight because ego grows fastest when fed gently. And over burgers and overpriced drinks, he revealed more than he realized, mentioning leverage strategies off-ledger, arrangements, and future plans to consolidate remaining beneficiaries under management fees. And I recorded none of it because I did not need recordings, I needed patterns, and patterns were already screaming. That night I updated my archive, labeling folders with dates, cross-referencing public filings, matching them against trust clauses. And the more I worked, the more I realized Evan's downfall would not come from one explosive revelation, but from cumulative weight, 1,000 small violations forming an undeniable picture of misconduct. And the beauty of it was that I did not need to accuse him. The system would do that for me. As months passed, Evan expanded aggressively, using trust assets as collateral without proper disclosure, a move that technically required unanimous beneficiary notification, which never happened. And when one cousin casually mentioned not understanding a new tax document, I felt the ground shift, because confusion is the first tremor before exposure. And I gently advised them to request clarification, not accusing, just asking questions, because questions force paperwork, and paperwork exposes truth. Evan responded with charm at first, hosting family meetings, explaining complexities in simplified terms, dismissing concerns as misunderstandings. But the more he explained, the more contradictions appeared, and Marcus confirmed what I already suspected. Evan's explanations created audit triggers, because consistency is the language of legitimacy, and Evan had lost fluency. The trust administrator, a regional firm that had remained passive for years, began requesting documentation, minor at first, routine compliance reviews, and Evan dismissed them as procedural noise, telling me confidently that everything was under control. And I smiled again, because control is always an illusion before collapse. Behind the scenes, Marcus submitted a formal request for independent audit review, not as an accusation but as a procedural recommendation based on conflict indicators, and because the trust charter mandated neutrality, the administrator could not refuse, and that was the moment the machine began turning. Evan noticed delays in fund access, minor restrictions framed as temporary, and frustration crept into his voice during calls, irritation replacing confidence, and still he did not suspect me because betrayal rarely looks backward. It assumes enemies must announce themselves loudly. Family tension grew subtly, whispers at gatherings, cautious glances, questions. Evan answered defensively now, and I remained calm, supportive, even defending him publicly when accusations surfaced, because nothing disarms suspicion like loyalty, and loyalty was my disguise. The audit findings arrived quietly, not with drama, but with numbers, timelines, compliance gaps, and a pattern of self-dealing that could not be explained away, and the administrator issued a temporary freeze on discretionary transactions pending full review, a move Evan interpreted as inconvenience, but Marcus interpreted as the beginning of the end. Evan called me late one night, voice tense, asking if I had noticed anything unusual, and I told him honestly that I had noticed he seemed stressed, and that maybe he should slow down, because advice feels sincere when it arrives too late, and he laughed nervously, thanking me, unaware that the trust structure he manipulated was now closing around him like a net designed long before he ever imagined himself above it. When the family was formally notified of the audit, reactions ranged from confusion to disbelief, and Evan attempted damage control, sending emails, scheduling meetings, framing the situation as bureaucratic overreach, but credibility once cracked never seals cleanly, and the more he spoke, the less convincing he became. Marcus warned me that the next phase would be psychological, because people confronted with collapse either confess or double down, and Evan chose the latter, initiating aggressive legal maneuvers to retain control, filing motions, contesting audit authority, and those actions triggered escalation clauses he never bothered reading, clauses that allowed the administrator to suspend his executor privileges pending resolution. And when that happened, Evan lost the very power he relied on to manage perception. The moment he was removed as acting controller, everything changed, because access creates confidence, and without access, Evan was just another beneficiary with a reputation problem, and suddenly family members asked questions they had avoided for years. Bank statements were reviewed with fresh eyes, and stories Evan told no longer aligned with numbers on paper. He confronted me in person for the first time with suspicion, not accusation but desperation, asking if I knew anything. And I looked at him calmly and said the truth, that systems respond to patterns, not people, and if patterns exist, they surface eventually, and that answer terrified him more than denial ever could. The trust administrator completed the audit summary and forwarded it to legal counsel, not for criminal prosecution yet, but for restitution assessment, and Marcus explained that restitution would require Evan to repay misused funds or forfeit his remaining share. And that was when Evan finally understood that this was not about embarrassment, it was about survival. He tried negotiating privately, offering me a settlement, partial restoration, even apologies framed as misunderstandings. But apologies mean nothing when consequences arrive, and I declined politely, because I did not build a counterplot to bargain, I built it to finish. And as Evan's world narrowed, mine expanded, not through wealth yet, but through clarity, because clarity is the most underrated form of victory. And as the family trust prepared to reassign control, Evan realized too late that betrayal does not always meet resistance. Sometimes it meets patience, and patience waits until there is nowhere left to run. When Evan lost control of the trust, he did not lose his arrogance immediately, because arrogance does not disappear when power fades. It transforms into denial, and denial became his new strategy. But denial is fragile when reality keeps knocking, and reality arrived, in the form of certified letters, formal notices, and calendar invitations he could not cancel. because the trust administrator moved fast once authority shifted, appointing an interim fiduciary whose only loyalty was to compliance, not family. And that was the second fatal mistake Evan made, assuming family dynamics would soften consequences, because professionals do not negotiate with emotion, they follow procedure. The interim fiduciary began restructuring immediately, separating legitimate investments from questionable ones, and every separation exposed another inconsistency, another undocumented transfer, another decision Evan justified verbally but never recorded properly, and the narrative he built for years began collapsing under its own weight. Family meetings became tense, no longer social but procedural lawyers, present minutes recorded silence heavy, and Evan sat there shrinking, no longer the confident executor, but a defendant without a courtroom, and I watched quietly, not with satisfaction yet, but with focus, because endings require precision. One cousin demanded answers, another demanded accountability, and Evan attempted to regain control through explanation, speaking faster, offering context, blaming complexity. But complexity is not an excuse in fiduciary duty. And the interim fiduciary shut him down repeatedly, reminding him that intent was irrelevant when outcomes violated structure. The restitution proposal arrived shortly after, a cold document outlining misused funds, interest penalties, administrative costs, and repayment timelines, and Evan faced drained of color as he read, because the sum exceeded his liquid assets, meaning repayment required asset liquidation, the same assets he proudly showcased for years as proof of his brilliance. Evan requested extensions, citing market conditions, legal review, personal hardship, and each request was denied calmly, because hardship does not excuse misconduct, and the trust charter was mercilessly clear. At this point, Evan finally turned to emotional leverage, reaching out to family members individually, framing himself as misunderstood, reminding them of shared childhoods, invoking loyalty, and some wavered. Briefly, because manipulation works best on memory, but the audit report was already circulating, and facts erode nostalgia quickly. When Evan approached me again, his confidence gone entirely, his voice low, his posture defensive, he did not ask for help directly. He asked for understanding, and I gave him exactly that. Understanding without forgiveness, because forgiveness without accountability is just permission repeated. I told him I understood how ambition can distort judgment, how fear of mediocrity can justify shortcuts, and how betrayal rarely feels evil to the person committing it. And those words broke him more than anger ever could, because they removed his final defense, the belief that he was exceptional. The trust administrator finalized the reassignment of control, restoring equitable distribution mechanisms, and for the first time since our grandfather's death, the trust operated exactly as intended. Transparent, balanced, boring even, and boring is the enemy of corruption. Evan was officially classified as a beneficiary under review, his remaining share restricted pending restitution compliance, and that status carried consequences beyond money, because it followed him into professional spaces, into credit evaluations, into partnership negotiations, because reputations are portable, and once stained, they travel everywhere. Evan attempted legal action against the trust administrator, filing claims of bias and procedural overreach, but those filings backfired because they triggered deeper discovery, exposing communications Evan assumed were private, revealing intent patterns that transformed negligence into misconduct. And Marcus warned me that Evan was now approaching a threshold where civil consequences could become criminal if he continued resisting, and Evan did continue resisting, because ego does not surrender quietly. The tipping point arrived when one of Evan's leveraged properties defaulted under scrutiny, because lenders reassessed risk once the trust froze collateral support. And default creates paper trails, regulators notice, and regulators ask questions that lawyers cannot deflect indefinitely. Evan was forced to liquidate assets rapidly, selling under pressure, watching years of accumulation evaporate in months, and with each sale, the illusion of superiority died another quiet death. Family dynamics shifted permanently. Not explosively, but irreversibly. Trust fractured, relationships cooled, and Evan's isolation became complete, because betrayal costs more than money, it costs belonging. Meanwhile, my position transformed subtly, not through grand announcements, but through acknowledgement. Family members began asking my opinion, administrators consulted me during restructuring, and credibility returned to me without effort, because credibility grows naturally when behavior aligns with principle. The restitution payments began arriving, partial at first, scheduled transfers monitored carefully, and with each payment, the trust balance corrected itself. restoring what was taken without fanfare, and that was the most satisfying part, because revenge often seeks pain, but justice seeks balance, and balance feels quieter, heavier, and far more permanent. Evan eventually stopped calling, stopped negotiating, stopped defending, because exhaustion replaced defiance, and exhaustion reveals truth without masks. The final family meeting was brief, procedural, almost anticlimactic. The interim fiduciary presented closure to final adjustments, and future governance structures designed to prevent recurrence, and Evan attended silently, eyes down, no longer fighting, just existing within consequences he created himself. When the meeting ended, Evan approached me one last time, not with anger or fear, but with something close to regret, and he said he never thought I would do this, and I corrected him gently, telling him, I never did anything, I only allowed the structure he abused to function properly, because the most devastating revenge does not require force, it requires alignment, and alignment always wins eventually. As Evan walked away, diminished but not destroyed, I felt no triumph, only resolution, because revenge fueled by rage burns quickly. But revenge built on patience lasts, and the trust fund returned to its intended purpose, supporting futures rather than feeding egos, honoring a grandfather promise without ever needing his voice again. And as my own share became accessible once more, I invested carefully, quietly, without spectacle, because power is loud only when it needs validation, and I no longer needed any. After the trust stabilized, life did not explode into celebration the way movies suggest. Instead, it settled into something far more powerful, quiet normalcy, because real victories do not announce themselves, they simply remove fear. And for the first time since our grandfather's death, I slept without the weight of uncertainty pressing against my chest, knowing the future was no longer controlled by someone willing to sacrifice blood for leverage. The trust administrator finalized long-term governance changes, rotating oversight, third-party audits, automatic disclosures, and those safeguards ensured no single person could ever repeat what Evan attempted. And that was the final confirmation that this was never just personal revenge, it was correction. Evan disappeared from family gatherings, slowly, not exiled, just absent, because shame isolates more efficiently than punishment. And when people asked about him, conversations shortened naturally, because betrayal becomes boring once consequences settle in. I watched from a distance as his professional life unraveled in parallel, not dramatically but steadily. Partnerships dissolved, lenders withdrew, invitations stopped arriving, and the same confidence that once opened doors now raised suspicion, because confidence without credibility is just noise. Months later, I received confirmation that Evan completed restitution fully, not out of redemption but necessity. And with that final payment, his formal obligations ended, but his informal sentence continued, because reputation does not reset when debts are paid. I never celebrated his fall because celebrating pain poisons victories. Instead, I focused forward, investing my restored share into ventures aligned with long-term value, ethical manufacturing, employee ownership models, boring sustainable growth, the kind of wealth that does not require secrecy. And in doing so, I honored the spirit of what our grandfather intended, not just the letter of it. One evening while sorting old documents, I found a handwritten note our grandfather once slipped into a book he gave me years before his death. A simple line that read, "Fairness is not generosity, it is discipline." And in that moment, I understood everything. Evan did not fail because he was greedy, he failed because he lacked discipline, and discipline always outlives ambition. Time softened the sharp edges of memory, but it did not erase lessons, because lessons earned through betrayal imprint deeply. And when younger family members asked quietly how the trust nearly collapsed, I did not dramatize, I explained systems, incentives, safeguards, and the cost of shortcuts, because stories are strongest when they educate rather than entertain. Evan eventually reached out once more years later, not to apologize, not to ask, but to acknowledge, and that acknowledgement mattered less than he expected, because closure does not require symmetry, it requires acceptance. And I had already moved beyond the need for his recognition. The family trust flourished steadily, supporting education, healthcare, and entrepreneurship exactly as designed. And that continuity became the true ending, because revenge is incomplete. If it only destroys, it must also restore. Looking back, I realized the most powerful part of the counterplot was not strategy or patience, it was restraint, the refusal to become what betrayal tries to create, because bitterness reproduces itself if left unchecked. Evan's betrayal triggered consequences, but it did not define me. And that distinction is where true power lives, not in winning, but in choosing what kind of person remains standing afterward. If you stayed with this story until the end, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment your thoughts below, because stories like this remind us that silence can be strategic, patience can be lethal, and justice does not always arrive loudly, but it always arrives eventually when truth is allowed to breathe.